Well, good morning, and thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for this introduction, Kate. I anchored my talk in line with the two previous symposiums that the People and Place cluster actually had in the previous 2 years, making place and placelessness, much more so, if you will, than the issue of diversity. So you will not hear either about the diversity of the Dalai Lama nor that of Kate Bishop in my talk today. I'm an architect and an urban historian who studies cities, and my occupation in the past 20 years has been principally with looking at the changes that globalization has actually brought to the world. At this particular moment, many scholars, as you know, have argued that cities of the world are becoming increasingly alike and increasingly homogenized. I will, however, suggest that the situation is much more complex, and I will argue that in the era of globalization, where culture is increasingly becoming placeless, urbanism will continue to have a considerable role. I will suggest that urbanism will not simply surrender to cyberspace, and that it will continue to be a vibrant arena where one can observe how different forms of global domination are influenced, mediated, or even generated by local struggles. Of course, at the heart of all of this is the issue of identity. And identity is a very complex topic, particularly as it relates to cities, the identity of people who live in cities and to what extent they endow the city with their identity. Family, ethnicity, religion, language, and history have all been claimed as identity constituting elements that are often handed down from one generation to another in a process that we normally refer to as tradition. Now, tradition is based on valuing constraint, and in a technological world of limitless choices, the conflicts between the traditional and the modern become unavoidable. To cast the traditional as pure and the modern as corrupt, or even vice versa, in my opinion, is completely naive. As much research has demonstrated, the traditional modern dialectic, in fact, is very problematic. In fact, no society ever described itself, if you will, as traditional or understood itself as such until the invention of the modern. So the two terms are very much dualistic, if you will. Even the dichotomies that we live with in the world today, the dichotomies that many international organizations subscribe to, you know, the first world and the third world, the north and the south, the core and the periphery, the developed world and then the underdeveloped world. Many of these are actually artificial categories if you look at them very carefully. Of course, here we have to recognize that all societies are constructed often in a relationship to each other or to one another. For example, notice that the dominant term in each of these dualities, the North, the East, the West, the North, the core, is mainly defined in difference and constructed in opposition to the other. And in studying the relationship between these dominant and dominated groups of people or societies, I have suggested in earlier work 4 phases which I think allow us to even understand this transition or this transformation. The colonial period, the era of independence and nation building, and the era of globalization, which we currently have. I have also suggested that each of these phases has a corresponding kind of form, if you will, the indigenous, vernacular, the hybrid, the modern or the pseudo-modern, as well as the postmodern. So what I'm going to try to do is very briefly in the next 5 or 10 minutes, talk more about what this really means for the production of the built environment. Now, before colonialism, we had traditional communities, and I put traditional here in quotes, living in pre-industrial, often insular conditions. Although some form of economic exchange occurred between the two supposed worlds, interaction with and curiosity about the other was limited. This was a stage where the form of settlements may have been an immediate reaction to the surrounding natural environment. Whether it was, for example, a city like Hyderabad that you actually see here now in Pakistan, a city whose entire skyline is completely shaped by the wind scoops that were attempting to capture a bit of air to cool down the courtyards of these individual houses. Or Luoyang in China, which is a troglodyte settlement of courtyard houses basically buried into the ground. Each is almost the size of a tennis court, where you can even barely see the entrances. But the entrances in reality, in this case, happen to be the staircases that are here that take you down, on which usually there is a tree to identify or designate the entrance of each house. In a sense, this was an escape from harsh climate that created very specific environmental conditions and that resulted in very specific formal solutions. These settlements appear to have been shaped mainly by the basic shelter concerned and the absence of alternative material. They reflect possibly at a subconscious level a match between the identity of the inhabitants and their limited access to resources. I show you this as an example actually from old Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, a settlement where when you ask here, where is the street, you can barely see it. And the reason that you can barely see it is because the street is actually buried under the rooftops, where the rooftops were principally used as the arena for women, and the main street at the lower level was that for men. Whether we accept or reject this gender division, this was the way it actually was in these societies. Now, around the middle of the 19th century, the world witnessed the rise of modern industrial capitalism and the emergence of organized political dominance represented by colonialism initially and then later by imperialism with the formation of empires. And under this colonial paradigm, the world became divided into two kinds of people and two types of societies. And I'm very much reminded by Nancy's beginning quote that reminds us of where we stand in relationship to the Aboriginal people of Australia. These two societies were powerful, administratively advanced, racially Caucasoid, nominally Christian, and principally European dominant nations, and powerless, administratively backward, traditionally rooted, mainly non-white dominated societies. The paradigm shift from the traditional to the colonial created a relationship of unequal cultural and socioeconomic exchange. It was, in a sense, a master-servant relationship, as this very specific illustration that comes to us from the Illustrated London Times in the late 19th century, basically the medium that was actually used to spread the word. So if we are to analyze the issue of identity in the cities of the world today, developing and developed, I think it is very important to understand the process by which this identity was ignored, was violated, was distorted, and was stereotyped throughout history. As a work of art, Jean-Léon Gérôme's reception of the Siamese ambassador on Fontainebleau is an excellent expression of this unequal relationship between the newly dominant and the newly dominated. In the 1850s, the Siamese, the country that we now call Thailand, were forced to open their ports to European trade and to exchange ambassadors with France. Jerome was commissioned to document the ceremony, and he chose to paint the single moment at which the Siamese envoys kneeled down to the representative of Western imperial might, in this case the Queen. Now, of course, as you probably know, the idea of kneeling down to a king, particularly in the context of Thailand, is very common. But because it was in a totally different context, in this case, coming in and seeing the Queen of France, it was totally understood, or it was understood in a totally different way, as a complete subjugation, if you will, of the colonized. Here, the problem of representation becomes very central because much of these artistic creations contributed to the making of the other and to enlarging the gulf between the dominant and the dominated, as, in fact, the other famous painting that you can see, The Snake Charmer, also by Jerome, which was used on the cover of Edward Said's seminal book, Orientalism. This is supposedly a naked boy entertaining a bunch of Arab bums, playing with a snake to the tunes of a flute player, who obviously is imported from India, but all of that is occurring in the middle of a mosque. I mean, that relationship in and of itself is very interesting. Now that the backwardness of this assumed traditional population has been established, at least to the rest of the masses back in the colonial homeland, it became legitimate to go about reforming it, civilizing it, or as the French called it, mission civilisatrice. In some instances, the colonial regimes proceeded to sniff out the ethnicity of the colonized culture. And when it actually failed to do so, by force, it resorted to the psychological technique of hypnotizing the middle class, as ironically demonstrated by the Goa House culture here in New Delhi, which represents the white settler subjugating the Buddha, in this case, the god. Obviously, all of this had an effect on the physical fabric of cities. Everywhere they went, the colonists introduced their own brand of settlements. I'm talking here about the overall planning model that determined the pattern of urban development in both the countries of the core as well as the countries of the periphery. This was the era in which, in fact, the straightforward ideas, if you will, would emanate from Europe and would spread to the rest of the world, as indicated here in a sketch by one of the modern movement's most famous architects, Le Corbusier. Everything would originate from Paris, it will go down to Algiers, and then it will go down to the rest of the French possessions in Black Africa. So this second phase of colonial domination often gave us urbanistically and architecturally a hybrid condition. And we start to see certain types of architecture and urban language that, at least at a visual level, unifies the land of the colonial empires, British lands, French lands, so on and so forth. This hybrid often borrowed from both the colonial homeland and the indigenous vernacular. The British bungalow in India, and I'm giving you an example of a very early bungalow in this case, a hybrid dwelling type, was no more Indian than British, just like the Dutch villa in Indonesia was no less Indonesian than Dutch, one may argue. Now, when the people of the dominated societies started to rebel against this colonial world order, they had little to cling to in their drive to establish their own sovereignty, other than the terms of the existing order with its baggage of physical realities and ideological constructs, like, for example, the nation state. Groups of people living in one region, under a colonial power, possibly having in common only a colonial history, but belonging to different languages, different ethnicities, different religions, and even different traditions, had to band together to achieve this new, supposedly more advanced stage of independence. The few commonalities between them were highlighted, while the differences were suppressed in the pursuit, if you will, of this noble goal of freedom and independence. What happens here is that the national identity based on short-term political interest and the ideology of struggle emerged as the driving force behind most nationalistic movements, I would argue, in much of the world in the middle of the 20th century. Once independence was achieved, the glue that bound together these various groups was no longer as pervasive. Indeed, the events of the late 80s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and later the collapse of Czechoslovakia, and later the collapse of Yugoslavia, and now the collapse of Iraq and Syria, are a testament to the true association of these people, where tribe, ethnicity, race, or religion emerged as the prime definers of their collective identity. Now, architecturally speaking, this third era of independence and nationalism did not immediately change the condition of cities in the developing world, because during the era of colonialism, important and irreversible decisions that affect the production of the built environment were already taken and, if you will, institutionalized. And we see that actually happening in many cities around the world. I'm giving you an example here again from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So this is exactly what the housing form used to be. And this is the housing form that was legislated after modernity. So suddenly courtyards were literally banned. Why? Because you had to leave setbacks from all of the different houses as well as from the street, creating an environment that was totally uncomfortable, both climatically as well as totally inappropriate socially. Similar thing actually happens with the adoption of public housing. So ironically, while public housing in many parts of the developed world was being torn down because it didn't necessarily suit lifestyles, it was being adopted in many countries of the former colonized lands in the third world as the most appropriate solution, if you will, to house the urban poor. Now, this brings me to the era of globalization, when the reconstruction of identity, if you will, becomes paramount. For once independence was achieved and once the dust from the struggle had actually settled, the problems of nation and community harmony started to resurface. When it was not resolved, religious and political fundamentalism flourished. Of course, there comes a point in the life of all formerly colonized societies where they start absorbing this colonial heritage as their own. When is this point reached? When did the forms of the British colonizers become the vernacular heritage, for example, of the eastern United States? When did the Spanish colonial settlement forms in many parts of Latin America emerge as the traditional architecture that attracts tourists in many of those countries today? Here, and in relationship to culture, I would venture to tell you, or to suggest, that in all of us as individuals, as communities, and even possibly as nations, there are two conflicting sentiments. In the first, one resorts to culture and tradition out of fear of the other. The second sentiment, characterized by interest in the culture of the mysterious other, emerges often from a totally different feeling, the desire to share in the collective consciousness of a totally different group of people. The tremendous movement of citizens across borders and the rise of protected ethnic minorities demonstrate that these two sentiments, both legitimate, are not necessarily contradictory. In fact, they often happen simultaneously or alternatively. Much of my own work for the past 2 decades has dealt with this very specific issue in detail in 2 books, Consuming Traditional Manufacturing Heritage and The End of Tradition. In the first book, I employed the lens of tourism to problematize many of the assumptions regarding heritage and tradition in an attempt to understand how built environments are often packaged and sold in an increasingly global economy of image consumption. In The End of Tradition, I argued that we have reached the end of tradition too, but by this I simply meant the end of our conception of it as a repository of authentic and hence valuable ideas that have been handed down from one generation to another that needs to observe it. In the era of globalization, nations find themselves having to compete in an ever-tightening global economy as they find themselves needing to exploit their heritage to attract international investors and tourists. Tourism development has hence produced entire places that cater almost wholly or are even inhabited year-round by the other. The new form appears to be the outright manufacture of heritage coupled with the active consumption of tradition. Now, in looking at the heritage discourse in the First World and the Third World, one may notice that while both possess equal desire to explore the culture and heritage of the other, they have fundamentally different motivations for wanting to do so. These differences may be attributed to or explained by earlier relationships, of course, of colonialism, political nationalism, and economic dependency, as I discussed earlier. Today, as a result of such historical and economic forces, third world countries often wish to emulate the progress of first world countries and adopt its developmental practices, but only if it does not destabilize their local culture, which is a very difficult equation to achieve. This is clearly a situation of wanting to have one's cake and eating it too. Thus, as Benjamin Barber points out in his appropriately titled book, Jihad versus McWorld, many nations want traditions of the veil, but they also want the Coca-Cola and communication technology and the World Wide Web, provided that they can partly control it. Meanwhile, for its part, the First World appears more interested in consuming the cultures and environments of third world societies. First world nations are often the main advocates for the financial patrons for the preservation of third world built environments as part of what they define as universal heritage, even if those countries' natives do not recognize its historic value. I specifically here actually show the case of the Buddhas, the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan under the Taliban regime and the tremendous outcry that followed their destruction. They were, as you know, dynamited during that time. As a wealthy bloc, which often feels a sense of guilt and responsibility towards its former colonies, the First World has also tried at times to maintain or assist in preserving the dying or disappearing lifestyles and traditions of underdeveloped people and places. Yet, it's also often the case that such efforts, while at the same time are engaged in, the First World also condemns or rejects many of the societal practices of these societies, especially when they diverge from Western standards of human rights, gender equality, and environmental sustainability. A very good example here is the case of the Babri Mosque in Odia in India, which was basically demolished by Hindu fundamentalism, despite the fact that it was a 15th century structure, because it supposedly existed on the site which was the birth site of the god Ram. Now, of course, one can imagine what this would have been like if this was the Dome of the Rock, and what kind of war it would have started in the Middle East. Now, moving to the second part of my talk, which attempts to relate all of this to the kind of developments that are going on in the world, particularly in the arena of tourism, one may distinguish, I would argue, 3 types of places that are being produced with the planned intent of making them places for the representation of the culture and tradition of the other. The first type is what I call dream landscapes that replicate historical settings based on the notion of using history to create a Wizard of Oz-like place where all conflicts within a given culture are resolved, and where all cultural aspects are reduced to their basic representations. In such a vision, all icons of culture, such as architectural style, building typology, spatial configurations, simply become the cultures that they are meant to represent. Authenticity here is desired, if you will, and is achieved through the manipulation of images and experiences. The ultimate example, of course, is Disneyland, or Disney World, or Euro Disney, or many of the Disneys that exist. In Disneyland, such places actually prove that even if heritage is mimicked, totally mimicked, history still sells, and sells well. Now, there's a second type of place which uses history, but which actually have a legitimate claim to an authentic past. The attempt to resuscitate such places, sometimes they're even entire cities, by making them in their former image, may serve one or both primary motives: to attract tourists for financial gain, but also to serve as banks of national memory against change. Colonial Williamsburg in the United States is a very good example of such an environment. A replica of the capital of Revolutionary Era Virginia, it is arguably America's premier public history site. Yet, like other history museums, its legitimacy depends on its claim to a real history, as embodied in actual buildings and artifacts. Ironically, Colonial Williamsburg has long been dismissed by many critics, including myself, simply as a theme park. And I say that because one may ask, as the park administrators actually did in the 80s, many of them did not stay, where is the uncomfortable African-American experience of slavery in this narrative of nationhood? Of course, and I specifically showed this image where the park's administrators decided that the best way to resolve that is to bring in a few black people who can play slaves in the context of the settlement. So when you go in to visit, everybody that's serving you is black, because that is exactly what Revolutionary Era Virginia was like. Santa Fe, New Mexico provides a slightly different example of that second type. Here, while the built heritage may be real, its meaning has long been diluted. Thus, although the town's distinctive indigenous adobe forms may be historically inspired, they have long been disassociated from their original culture and historic context. So now their consumption operates at almost a purely commercial level. It is well known that much of Santa Fe's authentic-looking adobe structures are, in fact, cement-plastered wood frame building that give the appearance of adobe. The architecture of Santa Fe, accordingly, has caused one group of critics to label the town Santa Fake. In this regard, and I really mean this, in this regard, and I'm going to try to illustrate that in a second, one might contrast what I call the fake authenticity of Santa Fe, possibly with what I call the authentic fakery of Las Vegas. I'll come to that point again. A third type are nostalgic places that exploit cultural heritage in an attempt to normalize it for everyday life. The town of Poundbury, that originated with Prince Charles's fight with the British architectural establishment, particularly so-called modern architects. As you know, he hates modern architecture. I've never been able to understand why, is a very good example of that. A traditional English village designed by Leon Creer and built on land owned by the prince, it was an attempt to create the feeling of a community that has grown over time, as if it has always been there. Of course, the desired effect also includes a long stopover in the golden age of the 18th and 19th century, before the advent of architectural modernism. Thus, all services, including telephone lines, electric lines, gas, drainage, and what have you, are all buried in channels behind the housing, and the only satellite dish that serves the entire community is also buried behind a high masonry wall. The town is often derided by critics and described as a kitschy time warp, although it has actually become, one has to confess, very popular with residents and tourists. As one commentator pointed out, and I quote, "The effect is so polite and elegant, as English as a vicar's tea party," end quote. So going beyond these three types, which typify, for me, the modernist engagement with heritage in this era of globalization, we find ourselves encountering two different moments. I call these hyper-traditions and post-traditions, and I actually explored them in my latest book, which just came out less than a year ago. For those of us interested in the study of heritage and place, the far-reaching transformation brought by globalization requires us not only to recalibrate the idea of tradition, but also to reposition it altogether. This is so because globalization has intensified the process of delinking identity and place. And this is the most important aspect of my talk today. And in doing so, it challenged the idea or the notion that vernacular traditions are the true expression of a geographically specific and culturally homogeneous group of people. So in a sense, I think for those of us who are interested in place, this is a big challenge. I use the term hyper here to refer to the social and cultural realms created and maintained through contemporary technologies of communication and information transfer that have radically transformed our notions of time and space. I'm actually showing you here in the background what looks like New York, but it's not New York. It is, in fact, New York, New York, in the city of Las Vegas, with its Statue of Liberty. In the case of Las Vegas, cultural heritage is indeed deployed, but here the claim to history is non-existent. It is in such places that the loosening of ties between the signs of a culture and the reference may be most apparent. To optimize the desire of the producers, in this case the casino companies and the hotels, to manufacture cultural heritage, and the tourists to consume it, it becomes very common for both groups to totally dispense with any pretension to reality or authenticity altogether. Both groups are extremely comfortable with that. So, because of that, today many Americans feel that they no longer need to see the Eiffel Tower if they've seen the Eiffel Tower in Vegas. They're clearly entitled. In fact, the statistics show that there are more people who've seen Vegas and hence the Eiffel Tower in Vegas than they have seen the real Eiffel Tower in Paris. This is a real statistic. Unlike real cities, and you can actually see the Eiffel Tower here way in the background. Unlike real cities, which often resort to the manufacture of heritage for political purposes, or nations which have willfully allowed the consumption of their tradition by others out of economic necessity, Hyper Las Vegas is the ultimate simulacra. It is a safe place for the consumption of heritage of the other. Yet before dismissing Vegas and places like it as kitsch, one might consider that in Las Vegas there's no hidden agenda at all. Las Vegas presents the outright manufactured heritage based on the concept of copying the traditional forms of everywhere for the consumption of everyone who can afford it. In Las Vegas, the local and the exotic are torn out of place and time to be repackaged for the world bazaar. And this leads me to my last idea, that of post-tradition. I believe that the changes that the world has encountered since 9/11 have grave implications for us, people who study place. Some see the events of 9/11 as a symbol of the failure of globalization and the triumph of local frustrations that it engendered. Indeed, the euphoric idea of global freedom has been replaced by the very real threat posed by globally unbounded and unrestrained others. In Australia, the big debate that you guys have here is, are you going to strip citizenship from those who go and fight for the Islamic State? The problem is there are so many Islamic states that are waiting to happen around the world, and many of them are not Islamic at all. So how is it that one can actually deal with this phenomenon where people's belief is no longer, or belonging is no longer to a territory, to an entity with a passport? Indeed, I think that very specific euphoric idea of the global freedom has been replaced by this new threat. It is important to recognize that in the post-9/11 era, we witnessed the rise of this new paradigm, one which I have actually called, and many have contributed to that debate as well, after global. Not because we abandoned globalization, but because we need to move beyond its limitations as a theoretical discourse. This is not an end to globalization, but the emergence of a different form of engagement that is sharply at odds with the visions of liberal multiculturalism, which is what globalization was initially all about. Here, both religious fundamentalism and imperial hegemony, represented at one point in time by Al-Qaeda and by George Bush on the other side, begin to emerge as the new forms of global engagement. Identity in this after-global era becomes increasingly complex, as the connection between identity and place, as I said earlier, is no longer determined by heritage or by tradition. Unlike neo-traditional or pseudo-traditional settings, places like Dubai or like Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, may be considered post-traditional places. They are places that have acquired a global imageability based on precedents drawn from elsewhere. They are places that are in constant race with time, whose history is the current present. These look like they are fantastic images from a movie. Actually, no, this is Dubai. This is Dubai buried in clouds because its buildings have gone way up above the clouds. And again, you see this is the tallest building in the world today, Burj Khalifa. All this emphasis on the re-evaluation of tradition, its role in the production of the built environments, its demise in the face of globalization, all suggest its possible end. Indeed, if tradition is merely the dialectic fabrication of modernity, then does not the end of tradition as a meaningful object of inquiry suggest also the end of tradition as an objective reality? The post-traditional category offers the hypothetical possibility for individuals and groups, nations and corporations to choose from a rich display of traditions detached from their previous encumbrances with people, with places, or even, I would argue, with time. Here, the past of post-traditional places is not only invented, but is intentionally ignored in favor of an immediate present that is assumed to be the past. Dubai and its Palm Islands and Abu Dhabi and its museum complex are an excellent example that stands at the intersection of the post-traditional condition with this after-global moment. I'm sure many of you have actually seen this, but this is the part of Abu Dhabi that has the 4 famous museums, the Louvre Museum, the one that is being designed by Zaha Hadid, the one that is designed by Jean Nouvel, so on and so forth. And this is Palm Island, which actually cannot really be seen this way except from a plane or from the moon. Yet at the same time, there are so many of these developments. The newest one is called Universe, which has all of the different planets. It's also, made in, and then there's one called World where, you can buy Egypt or you can buy Ghana, and that is your site. These post-traditional environments are not simply places of mimicry or authenticity, fake simulacra like Las Vegas or Macau. They are places where the reference ceases to be a fixed moment in history related to place or nation and becomes instead a constantly moving target that legitimizes current actions and aesthetics. The connection to both history and geography is severed, and hence the historical and vernacular styles become either irrelevant or simply relics of the past. The impact on urbanism here is that cultural experience is likely to become less place-rooted and more informationally based. I think you can all figure this out or see it in your kids. Now, I would like to end this talk by returning to Disneyland that I referred to early on, and its main street, the street that has captured the imagination of visitors to Disneyland and Disney World as the most quintessentially American of all places. The way Main Street was actually designed in the first Disneyland in California, it was actually inspired by 2 important streets in Walt Disney's hometown and in Harper Goff, who was the first manager of Disneyland, first creative director of Disneyland, his hometown as well, Massillon, Missouri, and Fort Collins, Colorado. Both of these cities, in basically the time of economic desperation in the late 80s, found themselves in very bad economic shape. They didn't really know what to do. So ironically, they went to the Disney Corporation and they said, can you help us? And the Disney Corporation helped them. They decided to take those 2 main streets and remodel them in the image of Main Street, USA. So in a sense, this is a case where what inspired Disneyland was copying from Disneyland to continue to exist. Here, the fake copy becomes the instrument by which the original can continue to exist altogether. So I leave you with this thought. The traditions of place will always remain vibrant and alive and well as they are transformed and reinvented everywhere, every day by the many. But we all don't shape the built environment equally. Authenticity in this age will no longer be the definer of vernacular traditions or even of livable place. We must come to accept that what lasts in tradition today is the transient, the contingent, and the fleeting. These are the qualities of the 21st century. Thank you very much.